First of all, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me. It is a great pleasure and a great honor for me to give a lecture at this conference. And also a great responsibility because this conference has always been and hopefully will remain the ideal place for one to share one's ideas with and thoughts and findings with a distinguished linguistic audience. And so I hope to be up to this challenge. And last but not least, I certainly deeply regret the only thing, actually what I regret is that we can't all see each other in person and bump our elbows or shake hands or probably hug each other, which I would so gladly do to many of my dear friends there in St. Petersburg and elsewhere. So without further ado, I shall start. But yeah, should remove everything which is not needed. So can you see my presentation well?
Yes.
Great. So I'm going to talk about polysynthesis. I assume that everyone in the audience has some idea what polysynthesis is. However, the point is that, well, the point is to try to go beyond these ideas and to say something slightly more precise about it. So the term polysynthesis was coined by the French and also American linguist, ethnologist, and diplomat Pierre-Étienne Duponceau, also known as Peter Duponceau. And this term refers to structures in his wording in which the greatest number of ideas are comprised in the least number of words. And I also give here a quotation from his French treatise on the languages of North America. Indeed, this term was first applied to the languages of Native Americans, then to Chukotkan languages, all in the first half of the 19th century, and later similar structures were found elsewhere. Another important thing to remember about polysynthesis is that this notion is holistic. Linguists have and still tend to speak about polysynthetic languages rather than polysynthetic verbs or polysynthetic constructions, in contrast to, well, the fact that in general linguists stopped speaking about ergative languages or flexive languages. We all know that it is particular morphological or syntactic patterns which are ergative, flexive, and so on. With polysynthesis, it is different. Linguists still find nothing wrong in speaking about languages being polysynthetic. So what is polysynthesis according to more contemporary definitions? Well, the simplest approach is the one presented, for instance, in this quotation from Marianne Mitoun's important article of 1988. Polysynthetic languages are by definition those that exhibit a high number of morphemes per word. And indeed, polysynthetic languages form the extreme point of decline from isolating languages to analytic languages, and synthetic languages are, as famously presented in a numerical form, in Greenberg's classic paper on morphological typology, where he simply stated that polysynthetic languages are those that have 3 or more morphemes per word on average. However, one can and should certainly ask whether polysynthetic languages are in fact more than just languages with very long words. And if we want this notion to be meaningful and to yield any interesting results, we necessarily have to go beyond this very simple but also very crude characterization. So let's look at some examples. And at this point, let me remind you that this presentation is available in the Google folder and also in the chat. And I advise everyone to get hold of the file, because I won't have time to dwell on examples too much, and also by necessity, I will have to skip certain things which may be of interest. So I'm not going to discuss any of these examples in detail, just to show you what these languages with, or rather what these are verbs having lots of morphemes in them look like. So that's an example from Barbareño, an extinct language in California. That is a very different example from Tiwi, a language from Northern Australia. This is still a very different example from Abaza, a Northwest Caucasian language. And remember that I'm going to speak about polysynthesis in Northwest Caucasian languages in greater detail. So in this example, we see that Abaza is able to express as a single word form something which is a complex biclausal construction in English. But finally, I simply can't help giving you an example from another language I have worked on for quite some time, that is from Lithuanian. This is a very long and complex verbal form in Lithuanian, which is also translated into English as a simple sentence, but with a sentence containing quite a lot of words. And the question is this also an example of polysynthesis? And most people would say no, but the question is, if it's not polysynthesis, then why it's not polysynthesis? And actually, I addressed this question in a recent paper of mine, which you can find in the references. So the problem is that there is no general and agreed upon definition of polysynthesis, and even the recent encyclopedic, more than almost 1,000-page thick Oxford Handbook of Polysynthesis doesn't provide a general and agreed upon definition. So we have to discuss some of the recent definitions and try to see what they tell us about polysynthesis. So Nicholas Evans and Hans-Jürgen Sasse, in their introductory chapter to a volume entitled Problems of Polysynthesis of 2002, say that a prototypical, and I'd like to underscore this word, the prototypical polysynthetic language is one which encodes information about both the predicate and all its arguments in a single word, and allows this word to serve alone as a freestanding utterance. Another definition, now from the Oxford Handbook of Polysynthesis by Michael Fortescue, reads as follows: to qualify as a core polysynthetic language, recall Evans and Zasser write about prototypical polysynthetic languages, and Fortescue writes about core polysynthetic languages. A language must display holophrasis, that is, has an ability to represent a whole clause, including all bound core pronominals by a single word, and must allow more than one lexically heavy morpheme within the holophrastic verb. And there is also a different definition, also from the Oxford Handbook by Johanna Martinsson, where she says that languages qualify as polysynthetic if they have complex polymorphemic verbs which necessarily integrate productive non-root bound morphemes with lexical and grammatical meaning. And further, in another paper of hers, Matheson observes that polysynthesis is not a homogeneous principle of language structure, but comprises a range of heterogeneous phenomena such as polypersonalism, noun incorporation, verb root serialization, and some others. And this is all very important for an understanding of polysynthesis, and also for the typology of this phenomenon. I shall skip this slide with further quotations from Marianne Mithun. And go to the characteristic features of polysynthesis, which can be distilled from all these definitions. So these characteristic features are holophrasis, that is, a verb can stand for a whole clause. Polypersonalism, that is, expression of arguments by bound pronominal affixes. The so-called productive non-inflectional concatenation, a term introduced by Willem de Rose, which is a special kind of morphology, especially characteristic of polysynthetic languages. Related to these are the so-called lexical affixes, that is, affixes with very concrete meanings, and we shall discuss them in greater detail later, and also incorporation, or more generally, dependent head synthesis. And all these characteristics contribute to polysynthesis, but it is often the case that any particular polysynthetic language shares only some of these characteristic features and not all of them. What I'd like to add to this general picture, probably somewhat speculatively, is that polysynthesis can be viewed as a specific way of drawing boundaries between lexicon and grammar on the one hand, and within grammar between morphology and syntax on the other. Indeed, if according again to a quotation from Duponceau, that in polysynthetic languages we can form words indefinitely, the distinction between inflection and derivation, and more generally between lexical storage versus online creation of complex morphosyntactic units, is probably blurred. However, there has been large disagreement between linguists regarding this. I shall also skip some tentative evidence from first language acquisition, which is very important for our understanding of polysynthetic languages, and also a burning issue because very few of these languages are still acquired by children. And I will go to the second point. So again, polysynthesis can be viewed as a specific way of drawing boundaries between morphology and syntax. In polysynthetic languages, verbal morphology is employed to express and manage syntactic relations, both intraclausally and often interclausally, to what can be considered a greatest possible extent. And in turn, the productive subsystems of polysynthetic morphology often display syntax-like properties like additivity, compositionality, and recursion, at least to a certain extent. And this is partly and largely what characterizes Deleuze's productive non-inflectional concatenation. And later, when I'll talk about Northwest Caucasian languages, I will mainly focus on these aspects of polysynthesis, because I think that Northwest Caucasian languages nicely illustrate this particular point. And importantly, even in polysynthetic languages, regardless of the fact that, as I have just said, they in a certain way redraw boundaries between morphology and syntax in a specific way, the distinction between these two components are, at least in some polysynthetic languages, well, at least in those polysynthetic languages which I have worked on, still exists. It is not the case that these languages have only morphology, or which plays a role of both morphology and syntax, or it's not the case that we cannot distinguish between these two components of grammar. And anyway, although this is probably a small point, I'd like to point out that the validity of the distinction between morphology and syntax, which has recently been put to doubt by Hospelmatt, is orthogonal to the question of polysynthesis. There are polysynthetic languages, well, there are both polysynthetic and non-polysynthetic languages which have robust and robustly distinct morphology and syntax. And there are both polysynthetic and non-polysynthetic languages where this distinction is blurred to some or even to great extent. And I'm not going to dwell upon this problem anymore. Polysynthesis is a case of extreme morphological complexity, which takes extended periods of time to develop and is simultaneously vulnerable in situations of asymmetric language contact. And also importantly, polysynthesis is argued to be favored by specific sociolinguistic conditions, such as small communities with dense social networks, geographical isolation, and low degree of language contact, and especially no or just very few second language speakers. And last but not least, most polysynthetic languages are endangered, and therefore it is the linguist's duty to document and describe them before they are all gone. So far so good. Now I'm going to speak about classifying and typologizing polysynthesis. Again, I give these examples from Mapudungun and Western Apache just to show you that polysynthetic languages can look really very different. And indeed, polysynthetic languages differ widely along many parameters, both quantitative and qualitative, such as average or maximal number of morphemes per word, number and type of semantic features that they grammaticalize and express in their morphology, number of paradigmatically opposed affixes for each slot, maximal number of participants expressed by pronominal affixes, type of arrangement of morphemes within the word, degree of morphological and morphophonological transparency or opacity, presence, productivity, and types of incorporation, etc., etc. And facing this huge diversity is an important task. And surprisingly, there aren't, at least to my knowledge, many comparative works based on representative samples of polysynthetic languages and aiming to map their diversity and to parameterize their similarities and differences. Indeed, most of the important publications in polysynthetic languages, including those to which I refer in this presentation, deal with just one particular language or several selected languages. There is a famous exception, Mark Baker's monograph, The Polysynthesis Parameter, approaching this phenomenon from a generative perspective. And this is indeed very important, but I'm not going to deal with his ideas in this presentation at all, not because I don't like them, but because they deserve a whole separate investigation and discussion. What I'm going to base myself upon is a series of works by Johanna Mattisson, who has proposed a structural typology of polysynthesis on the basis of a 75 language sample. This is certainly not the last word on the issue, but of course it is a useful basis on which one can build future work upon. So, Mattisson proposes basically three parameters of the typology of polysynthesis. The first one is whether the verb stem can contain more than one lexical root. And here she distinguishes compounding versus affixal polysynthesis. In fact, Mattisson speaks about compositional polysynthesis, but compositional can be misleading, so I prefer to call this type compounding. The second parameter concerns the internal organization of the polysynthetic verb, and the third parameter relates to the number of arguments indexed in the verb by pronominal affixes. And we shall briefly discuss each of them in turn. So there are several subtypes of compounding found in polysynthetic languages. The best known one is noun incorporation, which has been subject to an enormous literature. And importantly, noun incorporation is by no means limited to languages that are usually considered polysynthetic. There is also adverb incorporation and also verb root serialization. Noun incorporation can be exemplified by Chukchi, and this is more or less straightforward and familiar. Adverb incorporation is less well known, It is found in many languages, actually in Chukchi as well, but I gave an example from Biningunbok, a Gunwinguan language of Northern Australia, where you see elements like again and wrongly incorporated in the verb. And verb root serialization is compounding of several verbal roots in one verbal form. And this is nicely exemplified by Yimas, a Papuan language of New Guinea. Let's now turn to lexical affixes, which is more or less the same as what Fortescue has called lexically heavy morphemes, and Matheson non-root bound morphemes with rather concrete meanings. What are lexical affixes? These are bound morphemes that are unable to form words by themselves, and this is what distinguishes them from roots found in compounds. However, they express meanings that are similar to the meanings encoded by roots or independent words in the same or other languages. This is more or less the best characterization one can give. So while clear cases of lexical affixes are perhaps uncontroversial, the notion itself is necessarily fuzzy. There are many semantic subtypes of lexical affixes, most amply are catalogized by Matheson in her 2006 paper. So some examples. In Purépecha, a language isolate from Mexico, there are lexical affixes denoting locations such as on the patio, in the street, inside a house, etc. In Bella-Coola, a Salesian language, there are lexical affixes corresponding to body parts. And in Central Alaskan Yupik, and in many, and it is actually a very robust and important trait of Eskimo Aleut languages. There are many suffixes with predicative meanings, such as have something, or eat or use something, be tired of something, etc. And this example from Nulch, previous formerly known as Nootka, a Caucasian language, actually illustrates that the lexical meaning of the verb can be expressed by lexical affixes alone, because here, according to the description of the language, the root itself is just a dummy. It doesn't provide any lexical meaning. It is needed for the verbal form to be well formed, or as something to which lexical affixes can attach to. Well, again, Lithuanian, where, as I argue in my paper, something like lexical affixes can also be found, and Lithuanian is not alone because, well, Russian and Slavic verbal prefixes are the closest these languages have to can provide, well, the closest these languages come to lexical affixes. And again, since the notion is fuzzy, it isn't a simple task to draw a boundary between lexical and non-lexical affixes, so to say. Yeah, internal organization. There are basically two major types. The one called layered or scope ordered, when the order of elements is determined by their semantic scope, and templatic, when the order is rigid and in many respects opaque. And many languages show elements of both types of organization in different subparts of their morphology. So here I show, here I show an example of scope ordered morphology from Southern Sierra Miwok, where we have the same affixes which can attach to the verb in two different orders, yielding predictably different semantics. And we'll see similar examples from Northwest Caucasian languages as well. And this is an example of templatic morphology in cat, where lexical and grammatical morphemes are interspersed in the verb. So Matheson Matheson offers a, well, a typology of polysynthetic languages based on these two parameters, and I won't go into details here because we have no time, and we can't justify her solution by looking at these individual languages. Finally, I'd like to discuss polypersonalism, that is indexing of at least two participants by bound pronominals in the verb, also known as head marking. The notion of polypersonalism is wrought into some definitions of polysynthesis, for instance, into the one by Fortescue. However, it can also, and probably should, be viewed as a parameter of variation. Indeed, while we have tripersonal indexing as in Yoakare, or bipersonal indexing as in Kumbarlang, where you see that of the three participants of a ditransitive verb, only two are indexed on the verb. The object, the direct object, the theme, doesn't have any pronominal affix corresponding to it. However, one can also find monopersonal indexing of just one participant in a more or less, in a language which is more or less uncontroversially polysynthetic otherwise. And finally, surprising as it may seem, we also find apersonal polysynthesis, that is, polysynthetic languages are, well, a language which looks polysynthetic on all other parameters, but lacks pronominal indexing in the verb. An example is Autu, one of the languages of New Guinea. And another point is that polypersonalism is found in many non-polysynthetic languages. In fact, polypersonalism is more or less the default for the languages of the world. And indeed, we find tripersonal indexing in Basque, which is not a polysynthetic language at all. And in this respect, it's important. The following quotation from Fortescue is important. It says that whereas head marking is essentially a matter of inflection, polysynthesis contains an essential derivational component. So even if polypersonalism is one of the characteristic traits of polysynthesis, it is neither necessary nor sufficient to count a language as polysynthetic. So I'm afraid I have to skip quite a bit if I want to tell you anything about Northwest Caucasian languages. So I'll skip a number of things, and so let us now look more closely at a polysynthetic language family. Northwest Caucasian languages are one of the three indigenous language families of the Caucasus, alongside North-Dagestanian and Latvian. It comprises three branches: Circassian, consisting of West Circassian or Adige, and East Circassian or Kabardyan; Abkhaz-Abaza, consisting of Abkhaz and Abaza; and Obykh, which is unfortunately extinct. Northwest Caucasian is arguably distantly related to the North-Dagestanian family, which is, however, not very important for our purposes. I'll have to, I'll skip the sociolinguistic information. This is the map. So let's now turn to major typological traits of these languages. They're famous for having a great number of consonants and very few vowels. They also have a weak distinction between major lexical classes. They are all ergative in their morphology and partly in their syntax. They have rich system of spatial marking in the verb, which is important for polysynthesis, a complex system of clause combining, and they are all head marking and polysynthetic. So this is a Bestine-Kabardian polysynthetic predicate, which contains lots of morphemes. And this is a Bestine-Kabardian polysynthetic nominal, and I have to skip the discussion of nominals altogether, although it's in fact can be interesting. The occasion are as follows. First, it is exuberant polypersonalism. Second, it is a rich system of locative affixes, and generally a number of productive affixes with different degrees of, lexicality. These languages possess an intricate mixture of templating and layered organization, and finally, a complex system of morphological expression of syntactic information. So let's have a look at polypersonalism. This is a relatively simple verbal form from Abaza, and it is not constructed but found in a text. And this verbal form translates as, I will tell this to him about you. So it has 4 affixes corresponding to 4 participants of the situation. And generally, in Northwest Caucasian, 3 participant forms, verbal forms, are common. 4 participant forms, like the one I've just shown, are uncommon, but they are attested in texts. But that's not all. Even 5 participant forms can be constructed and parsed by speakers, at least by speakers of Circassian languages, and they are reported in grammars of Circassian languages, and some of these grammars have been written by native speakers. 5 participants forms, however, are apparently impossible in the other branches of the family. And this is also of some theoretical, can be of some theoretical importance, but I'm won't dwell on it. What facilitates polypersonalism in Northwest Caucasian is a rich system of semantically specialized applicatives introducing indirect objects. Yeah, thank you, Sonia. I think I'll need to speak till 10 to 6. Hopefully not more. So applicatives in these languages are very numerous. They do not normally affect core arguments because they introduce indirect objects and not affect the S, A, and P. They combine with all types of verbs, both transitive and intransitive, and their semantics ranges from something very general to something highly specialized. So you've actually already seen a benefactive applicative in the example from Abaza I gave you above. And here is applicative stacking in West Circassian. They were making me read it to you, benefactive together with us, committed it. There is some applicative recursion also in West Circassian. I write to him, benefactive, for their benefit, also benefactive. Some arguments are obligatorily expressed by applicatives. For instance, various recipients or indirect objects of bivalent intransitive verbs, such as touch. There are also locative applicatives, and actually a great variety of them, and also lexicalized applicatives. And from applicatives, we naturally come to lexical affixes in Northwest Caucasian because these classes of affixes actually intersect to a considerable degree. There are actually quite a lot of lexical affixes and quite a lot of different types of lexical affixes in these languages, at least according to Matteson's ontology. I'll give some examples. So this is from Ubich, and while one could probably argue that these affixes are grammatical and not lexical, but well, I'm basing myself on Matteson, and for her, at least some of them count as lexical. Yeah, that's an example from Abaza, also with a bunch of affixes. This is elicited. But importantly, the largest set of lexical affixes in Northwest Caucasian languages express spatial meanings. These are simplex and complex locative preverbs, of which there is a great number in these languages. These are also directional suffixes, which are most prominent in Circassian, and prefixes and suffixes often combine with each other, and some combinations are lexicalized. And importantly, many locative preverbs, actually in Circassian, all locative preverbs are applicatives. So these are examples of locative prefixes in Standard Kabadian. You see that there is a lexical root meaning lie, or more, actually it has a more general locational meaning, and it obligatorily occurs with a prefix specifying, well, the topological type of the location. Being in a plate is different from being in a cupboard, etc. These are examples of directional suffixes and circumfixes like around or up. And importantly, diachronically, most locative proverbs in Northwest Caucasian go back to incorporated nouns, mainly denoting body parts or other objects. So in West Circassian, intestines as a verbal prefix means something like inside or through, and mouth means something like near. And some proverbs can be synchronically viewed as incorporated nouns because they denote the same object as the noun and can host pronominal prefixes which refer to the possessor of the noun. They are marginal in Circassian and more widespread in the other branches. So in Kabardhian, we have incorporated head and incorporated hand. In Abaza, we have incorporated face, for example. But in Abaza, also non-relational nouns can be incorporated. So we have incorporated cradle, and in Abkhaz, we have incorporated winter. And there is also some evidence of verb root serialization as well, but I have to skip it because I don't have time anymore, which is a pity, but it almost always happens with me. So in terms of Mattheson's typology, Northwest Caucasian polysynthesis is transitional between compounding and affixal. And so it's an interesting case because both noun incorporation and verb root serialization are attested, but they apply to closed classes of roots. And these incorporated roots tend to become grammaticalized and morphologically and morphosyntactically patterned with affixes, for instance, become applicatives. So I have to skip lots of interesting things because I want you to be able to ask some questions. So I'll skip some things. And yeah, let me tell you that morphological organization in Northwest Caucasian is not uniform and defies any straightforward analysis in terms of semantic scope or syntactic derivation. And on the other hand, it doesn't fit into a rigid template either. And it obviously reflects different historical layers of successive grammaticalization and morphologization, as well as obviously lexicalization. And importantly, a large part of the Northwest Caucasian polysynthetic morphology serves the purposes of syntax. And these are pronominal affixes, applicatives, causative and other valency changing mechanisms, reflexive and reciprocal marking, nominalizations and converbs, the nominal complex, about which I have told you nothing, and relativization, which is also expressed by bound pronominals of sorts. Like here. Relative affixes in Northwest Caucasian occupy the same slots as the corresponding personal affixes, and they can be considered morphologically bound presumptive pronouns. And this I skip, and so I conclude. Northwest Caucasian languages adhere to the cross-linguistic prototype of polysynthesis, but show a number of specific features, such as extraordinary personalism enhanced by an extremely rich system of applicatives, vestiges of different types and diachronic layers of incorporation in the system of lexical affixes, predominantly spatial profile of lexical affixation, which is in fact an aerial feature which even goes beyond the Caucasus, and last but not least, highly developed syntactic functions of morphology, including a cross-linguistically rare pattern of relativization, forming one of the core aspects of the morphosyntax of these languages. And some general observations. So, well, one of the take-home messages of this talk is certainly that polysynthesis is an evasive and vague notion. However, is this notion useless? Well, it depends on one's perspective. If one wishes to formulate universal generalizations like Greenberg's, with polysynthesis as a part of the premise, then probably this notion won't help. However, if one wishes to map the blank spots of linguistic diversity, then this notion, in my view, is helpful. Polysynthetic languages are highly variable and in many respects exceptional, even though we can find polysynthetic-like traits in many more familiar languages. And both their variation and their exceptionality offer linguists and linguistics unique treasures of empirical facts and testing grounds for hypotheses and methods. And last but not least, most still living polysynthetic languages being endangered, it is the linguist's responsibility and duty to avail themselves of these treasures by means of unbiased description and documentation before it's too late. Thank you very much in many languages, and apologies for skipping too much and not being able to be on time.
Thank you very much for such an interesting talk. We have 7 minutes for questions and discussion. Please, if you have a question, you can raise your hand or put in the chat. Mash, please.
Thank you. I have a question concerning the last question of usability of the term polysynthesis, and it seems like it has a lot to do with Baker's ideas. But even if we put them apart, it seems that the idea of polysynthesis being connected to polypersonal agreement is questionable if we adhere to the usual definition of polysynthesis, because, well, there is a clear logical connection between the two. Obviously, if you have polypersonal agreement, it is more likely that you will have a lot of morphemes per word. So it would seem clear that you would have to count the morphemes without counting the personal agreement morphemes to make sure that there is some connection. I guess it has been done, but I'm not sure whether it has. So that's basically the question. If there would still be a tendency for polypersonal agreement in polysynthetic languages, if you do not consider the personal when counting. Yeah, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Masha. I hope I have understood your question correctly. Well, I actually don't know how to answer it properly and quickly. I'll probably be ambiguous and say, well, yes and no, because, well, and also I show this slide with the picture from Fortescue's encyclopedic article, where he outlines certain pathways to polysynthesis. And importantly, he says that in his definition of polysynthesis, there are two components, one related to head marking and another related to well, compounding or lexical affixation. And he says that polysynthesis arises basically by combining the two. And while polysynthetic languages actually differ quite a lot in how much weight they give to, well, polypersonalism on the one hand and other types of morphemes on the other hand, because, well, in Eskimo languages, there is more or less one morpheme expressing participants and lots of morpheme expressing everything else. In Northwest Caucasian languages, there are many morphemes expressing participants, at least two. And if you have three participants, then you will more often than not have an applicative affix introducing that morpheme. And if you want to have four, then you must have an applicative. But again, if it were only applicatives and personal affixes, it probably won't be enough. While there are Bantu languages which have lots of applicatives and lots of personal prefixes, but they aren't usually considered polysynthetic in this sense because they arguably don't have lexically, well, semantically very specific affixes. Or did I answer or not?
Well, actually, I don't think so, but I think it would be better to continue the discussion otherwise.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Fede, please.
Yeah, thank you for a very interesting talk. I wanted to ask, maybe it's a very particular question, but it's so interesting that I decided to ask it. At least for me, interesting. I mean, can one say, at least generally, that the lexical affixes, which, as far as I understood, correspond to full-fledged verbs in so-called in not polysynthetic languages, are they? Could they be classified? How to say? Is it true that the corresponding verbs in non-polysynthetic languages are usually raising verbs, or do they have some other types of verbs? For example, maybe control verbs. Yeah. So,
well, that's an interesting question, Fede. Thank you. Well, first of all, it's necessary to underscore that lexical affixes need not necessarily have verbal meanings. Most of them probably have nominal meanings. While with respect to those which have verbal meanings, this is really an interesting question, and since the languages I have worked on actually don't have many of these, I can't tell. But I'm wondering if specialists on Eskimo languages have thought about it in these terms. Probably yes. One should look into this sort of literature. This is certainly a question worth pursuing in a typological investigation. Thank you.
And the last question from Luba.
Well, I've got a question about polysynthesis and language acquisition. Do you have some information? How is the acquisition of polysynthetic languages is homogeneous with each other, having some differences from non-polysynthetic languages?
Thank you very much. This is a good question. Well, I certainly can only base myself on the available literature. So, and there isn't much literature on this topic, again, because very few polysynthetic languages are still acquired by children, but there is some evidence from Inuit. Here's a quotation from Helen. Children acquiring Inuit languages become competent in complex morphosyntax at an early age, producing productive causatives, passives, and non-incorporation structures as early as age 2. And this presents a striking contrast to children learning English, who are still struggling with basic morphology at the same age. On the other hand, while Marianne Mithun, in her paper on acquisition of Mahawk, presents data which is, well, not so divergent from what we actually find in languages such as English or Russian. And she also says that there is a great role of memorizing and memorization and chunking in polysynthetic, in both acquisition and production of polysynthetic morphology than one might suspect. So I think that it's different in different languages. And again, it's something one should study before it's too late. Thank you.